Chapter 1 of 3 Contributions to the Theory of Sex. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Contributions to the Theory of Sex by Sigmund Freud, translated by Abraham Arden Brill, 1874 to 1948. Section 1, the sexual aberrations, deviation in reference to the sexual object. The sexual aberrations. The fact of sexual need in man and animal is expressed in biology by the assumption of a sexual impulse. This impulse is made analogous to the impulse of taking nourishment and to hunger. The sexual expression corresponding to hunger not being found colloquially, science uses the expression libido. Popular conception makes definite assumptions concerning the nature and qualities of this sexual impulse. It is supposed to be absent during childhood and to commence about the time of and in connection with the maturing process of puberty. It is supposed that it manifests itself in irresistible attractions exerted by one sex upon the other, and that its aim is sexual union, or at least such actions as would lead to union. But we have every reason to see in these assumptions a very untrustworthy picture of reality. On closer examination, they are found to abound in errors, inaccuracies, and hasty conclusions. If we introduce 2 terms and call the person from whom the sexual attraction emanates the sexual object, and the action towards which the impulse strives the sexual aim, then the scientifically examined experience shows us many deviations in reference to both sexual object and sexual aim, the relations of which to the accepted standard require thorough investigation. 1. Deviation in reference to the sexual object. The popular theory of the sexual impulse corresponds closely to the poetic fable of dividing the person into 2 halves, man and woman, who strive to become reunited through love. It is therefore very surprising to hear that there are men for whom the sexual object is not woman but man, and that there are women for whom it is not man but woman. Such persons are called contrary sexuals, or better, inverts, the condition that of inversion. The number of such individuals is considerable, though difficult of accurate determination. A. Inversion. The behavior of inverts. The above-mentioned persons behave in many ways quite differently. A. They are absolutely inverted, i.e., their sexual object must be always of the same sex, while the opposite sex can never be to them an object of sexual longing, but leaves them indifferent or may even evoke sexual repugnance. As men, they are unable, on account of this repugnance, to perform the normal sexual act or miss all pleasure in its performance. B. They are amphigenously inverted, psychosexually hermaphroditic, i.e., their sexual object may belong indifferently to either the same or to the other sex. The inversion lacks the character of exclusiveness. C. They are occasionally inverted, i.e., under certain external conditions, chief among which are the inaccessibility of the normal sexual object and initiation, they are able to take as the sexual object a person of the same sex, and thus find sexual gratification. The inverted also manifest a manifold behavior in their judgment about the peculiarities of their sexual impulse. Some take the inversion as a matter of course, just as the normal person does regarding his libido, firmly demanding the same rights as the normal. Others, however, strive against the fact of their inversion and perceive in it a morbid compulsion. Other variations concern the relations of time. The characteristics of the inversion in any individual may date back as far as his memory goes, or they may become manifest to him at a definite period before or after puberty. The character is either retained throughout life, or it occasionally recedes or represents an episode on the road to normal development. A periodical fluctuation between the normal and the inverted sexual object has also been observed. Of special interest are those cases in which the libido changes, taking on the character of inversion after a painful experience with the normal sexual object. These different categories of variation generally exist independently of one another. In the most extreme cases, it can regularly be assumed that the inversion has existed at all times and that the person feels contented with his peculiar state. Many authors will hesitate to gather into a unit all the cases enumerated here and will prefer to emphasize the differences rather than the common characters of these groups, a view which corresponds with their preferred judgment of inversions. But no matter what divisions may be set up, it cannot be overlooked that all transitions are abundantly met with, so that the formation of a series would seem to impose itself. Conception of inversion. The first attention bestowed upon inversion gave rise to the conception that it was a congenital sign of nervous degeneration. This harmonized with the fact that doctors first met it among the nervous, or among persons giving such an impression. There are two elements which should be considered independently in this conception: the congenitality and the degeneration. Degeneration. This term degeneration is open to the objections which may be urged against the promiscuous use of this word in general. It has in fact become customary to designate all morbid manifestations not of traumatic or infectious origin as degenerative. Indeed, Magnan's classification of degenerates makes it possible that the highest general configuration of nervous accomplishment need not exclude the application of the concept of degeneration. Under the circumstances, it is a question what use and what new content the judgment of degeneration still possesses. It would seem more appropriate not to speak of degeneration. 1. Where there are not many marked deviations from the normal. 2. Where the capacity for working and living do not in general appear markedly impaired. That the inverted are not degenerates in this qualified sense can be seen from the following facts. 1. The inversion is found among persons who otherwise show no marked deviation from the normal. 2. It is found also among persons whose capabilities are not disturbed, who on the contrary are distinguished by especially high intellectual development and ethical culture. 3. If one disregards the patients of one's own practice and strives to comprehend a wider field of experience, he will in two directions encounter facts which will prevent him from assuming inversions as a degenerative sign. A. It must be considered that inversion was a frequent manifestation among the ancient nations at the height of their culture. It was an institution endowed with important functions. B. It is found to be unusually prevalent among savages and primitive races, whereas the term degeneration is generally limited to higher civilization. I. Block. Even among the most civilized nations of Europe, climate and race have a most powerful influence on the distribution of and attitude toward inversion. Innateness. Only for the first and most extreme class of inverts, as can be imagined, has innateness been claimed, and this from their own assurance that at no time in their life has their sexual impulse followed a different course. The fact of the existence of two other classes, especially of the third, is difficult to reconcile with the assumption of its being congenital. Hence the propensity of those holding this view to separate the group of absolute inverts from the others results in the abandonment of the general conception of inversion. Accordingly, in a number of cases, the inversion would be of a congenital character, while in others it might originate from other causes. In contradistinction to this conception is that which assumes inversion to be an acquired character, of the sexual impulse. It is based on the following facts. 1. In many inverts, even absolute ones, an early affective sexual impression can be demonstrated as a result of which the homosexual inclination developed. 2. In many others, outer influences of a promoting and inhibiting nature can be demonstrated, which in earlier or later life led to a fixation of the inversion, among which are exclusive relations with the same sex, companionship in war, detention in prison, dangers of heterosexual intercourse, celibacy, sexual weakness, etc. 3. Hypnotic suggestion may remove the inversion, which would be surprising in that of a congenital character. In view of all this, the existence of congenital inversion can certainly be questioned. The objection may be made to it that a more accurate examination of those claimed to be congenitally inverted will probably show that the direction of the libido was determined by a definite experience of early childhood, which has not been retained in the conscious memory of the person, but which can be brought back to memory by proper influences. Havelock Ellis. According to that author, inversion can be designated only as a frequent variation of the sexual impulse which may be determined by a number of external circumstances of life. The apparent certainty thus reached is, however, overthrown by the retort that manifestly there are many persons who have experienced, even in their early youth, those very sexual influences such as seduction, mutual onanism, without becoming inverts, or without constantly remaining so. Hence, one is forced to assume that the alternatives, congenital and acquired, are either incomplete or do not cover the circumstances present in inversions. Explanation of inversion. The nature of inversion is explained neither by the assumption that it is congenital, nor that it is acquired. In the first case, we need to be told what there is in it of the congenital, unless we are satisfied with the roughest explanation, namely, that a person brings along a congenital sexual impulse connected with a definite sexual object. In the second case, it is a question whether the manifold accidental influences suffice to explain the acquisition, unless there is something in the individual to meet them halfway. The negation of this last factor is inadmissible according to our former conclusions. The relation of bisexuality. Since the time of Frank Lydston, Kiernan, and Chevalier, a new series of ideas has been introduced for the explanation of the possibility of sexual inversion. This contains a new contradiction to the popular belief, which assumes that a human being is either a man or a woman. Science shows cases in which the sexual characteristics appear blurred, and thus the sexual distinction is made difficult, especially on an anatomical basis. The genitals of such persons unite the male and female characteristics, hermaphroditism. In rare cases, both parts of the sexual apparatus are well developed, true hermaphroditism, but usually both are stunted. The importance of these abnormalities lies in the fact that they unexpectedly facilitate the understanding of the normal formation. A certain degree of anatomical hermaphroditism really belongs to the normal. In no normally formed male or female are traces of the apparatus of the other sex lacking. These either continue functionless as rudimentary organs, or they are transformed for the purpose of assuming other functions. The conception which we gather from this long-known anatomical fact is the original predisposition to bisexuality, which in the course of development has changed to monosexuality, leaving slight remnants of the stunted sex. It was natural to transfer this conception to the psychic sphere and to conceive the inversion in its aberrations as an expression of psychic hermaphroditism. In order to bring the question to a decision, it was only necessary to have one other circumstance, viz., a regular concurrence of the inversion with the psychic and somatic signs of hermaphroditism. But this second expectation was not realized. The relations between the assumed psychical and the demonstrable anatomical androgyny should never be conceived as being so close. There is frequently found in the inverted a diminution of the sexual impulse, H. Ellis, and a slight anatomical stunting of the organs. This, however, is found frequently, but by no means regularly or preponderantly. Thus we must recognize that inversion and somatic hermaphroditism are totally independent of each other. Great importance has also been attached to the so-called secondary and tertiary sex characters, and their aggregate occurrence in the inverted has been emphasized, H. Ellis. There is much truth in this, but it should not be forgotten that the secondary and tertiary sex characteristics very frequently manifest themselves in the other sex, thus indicating androgyny without, however, involving changes in the sexual object in the sense of an inversion. Psychic hermaphroditism would gain in substantiality if, parallel with the inversion of the sexual object, there should be at least a change in the other psychic qualities, such as in the impulses and distinguishing traits characteristic of the other sex. But such inversion of character can be expected with some regularity only in inverted women. In men, the most perfect psychic manliness may be united with the inversion. If one firmly adheres to the hypothesis of a psychic hermaphroditism, one must add that in certain spheres its manifestations allow the recognition of only a very slight contrary determination. The same also holds true in the somatic androgyny. According to Halban, the appearance of individual stunted organs and secondary sex characters are quite independent of each other. A spokesman of the masculine invert stated the bisexual theory in its crudest form in the following words: "It is a female brain in a male body." But we do not know the characteristics of a female brain. The substitution of the anatomical for the psychological is as frivolous as it is unjustified. The tentative explanation by B. Krafft Ebing seems to be more precisely formulated than that of Ulrich, but does not essentially differ from it. B. Krafft Ebing thinks that the bisexual predisposition gives to the individual male and female brain centers as well as somatic sexual organs. These centers develop first towards puberty, mostly under the influence of the independent sex glands. We can, however, say the same of the male and female centers as of the male and female brains, and moreover, we do not even know whether we can assume for the sexual functions separate brain locations, centers, such as we may assume for language. After this discussion, two notions at all events persist. First, that a bisexual predisposition is to be presumed for the inversion also, only we do not know of what it consists beyond the anatomical formations. And second, that we are dealing with disturbances which are experienced by the sexual impulse during its development. The sexual object of inverts. The theory of psychic hermaphroditism presupposed that the sexual object of the inverted is the reverse of the normal. The inverted man, like the woman, succumbs to the charms emanating from manly qualities of body and mind. He feels himself like a woman and seeks a man. But however true this may be for a great number of inverts, it by no means indicates the general character of inversion. There is no doubt that a great part of the male inverted have retained the psychic character of virility, that proportionately they show but little of the secondary characters of the other sex, and that they really look for real feminine psychic features in their sexual object. If that were not so, it would be incomprehensible why masculine prostitution, in offering itself to inverts, copies in all its exterior, today as in antiquity, the dress and attitudes of woman. This imitation would otherwise be an insult to the ideal of the inverts. Among the Greeks, where the most manly men were found among inverts, it is quite obvious that it was not the masculine character of the boy which kindled the love of man, but it was his physical resemblance to woman as well as his feminine psychic qualities, such as shyness, demureness, and the need of instruction and help. As soon as the boy himself became a man, he ceased to be a sexual object for men and in turn became a lover of boys. The sexual object in this case, as in many others, is therefore not of the like sex, but it unites both sex characters, a compromise between the impulses striving for the man and for the woman, but firmly conditioned by the masculinity of body, the genitals. The conditions in the woman are more definite. Here the active inverts with special frequency show the somatic and psychic characters of man and desire femininity in their sexual object, though even here greater variation will be found on more intimate investigation. The sexual aim of inverts. The important fact to bear in mind is that no uniformity of the sexual aim can be attributed to inversion. Intercourse per annum in men by no means goes with inversion. Masturbation is just as frequently the exclusive aim, and the limitation of the sexual aim to mere effusion of feelings is here even more frequent than in heterosexual love. In women, too, the sexual aims of the inverted are manifold, among which contact with the mucous membrane of the mouth seems to be preferred. Conclusion. Though from the material on hand we are by no means in a position satisfactory to explain the origin of inversion, we can say that through this investigation we have obtained an insight which can become of greater significance to us than the solution of the above problem. Our attention is called to the fact that we have assumed a too close connection between the sexual impulse and the sexual object. The experience gained from the so-called abnormal cases teaches us that a connection exists between the sexual impulse and the sexual object, which we are in danger of overlooking in the uniformity of normal states, where the impulse seems to bring with it the object. We are thus instructed to separate this connection between the impulse and the object. The sexual impulse is probably entirely independent of its object and is not originated by the stimuli proceeding from the object. B. The sexually immature and animals as sexual objects. Whereas those sexual inverts whose sexual object does not belong to the normally adapted sex appear to the observer as a collective number of perhaps otherwise normal individuals, the persons who choose for their sexual object the sexually immature children are apparently from the first sporadic aberrations. Only exceptionally are children the exclusive sexual object. They are mostly drawn into this role by a faint-hearted and impotent individual who makes use of such substitutes, or when an impulsive, urgent desire cannot at the time secure the proper object. Still it throws some light on the nature of the sexual impulse that it should suffer such great variation and depreciation of its object, a thing which hunger, adhering more energetically to its object, would allow only in the most extreme cases. The same may be said of sexual relations with animals, a thing not at all rare among farmers, where the sexual attraction goes beyond the limits of the species. For aesthetic reasons, one would fain attribute this and other excessive aberrations of the sexual impulse to the insane, but this cannot be done. Experience teaches that among the latter, no disturbances of the sexual impulse can be found other than those observed among the sane, or among whole races and classes. Thus we find with gruesome frequency sexual abuse of children by teachers and servants, merely because they have the best opportunities for it. The insane present the aforesaid aberration only in a somewhat intensified form, or what is of special significance is the fact that the aberration becomes exclusive and takes the place of the normal sexual gratification. This very remarkable relation of sexual variations ranging from the normal to the insane gives material for reflection. It seems to me that the fact to be explained would show that the impulses of the sexual life belong to those which even normally are most poorly controlled by the higher psychic activities. He who is in any way psychically abnormal, be it in social or ethical conditions, is, according to my experience, regularly so in his sexual life. But many are abnormal in their sexual life who in every other respect correspond to the average. They have followed the human cultural development, but sexuality remained as their weak point. As a general result of these discussions, we come to see that under numerous conditions and among a surprising number of individuals, the nature and value of the sexual object steps into the background. There is something else in the sexual impulse which is the essential and constant. End of chapter 1.